Hi everyone, Alex Zosels, hailing from the Boston University Hearing Research Center, and I have Rachael Elliot with me. And today we're going to introduce a special topic. So you probably learned all about time domain signals in classes, basically how circuits and different dynamic things react over time. But there's another way to look at it. So they call that time domain, and then there's also frequency domain. And we thought an interesting way to present it would be in terms of an acoustical instrument. So I saved you the agony of listening to me playing clarinet, which I haven't done since high school. And so in order to keep things on a good note, we brought in Rachael, who is a professional bassoonist, and so I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and I appreciate the pun. That didn't go get lost. I teach bassoon across the river at Longy School of Music, and thanks for inviting me into your class today. So yeah, I'm a bassoon player, and I thought I'd start by just playing you a couple of very brief excerpts of things I love to do that the bassoon does. The first piece is opening of a caprice by a good friend of mine, Brad Balliet. And in it, you're gonna hear some tremolos, some kind of wild leaps that the bassoon can do really well, and a hint at the multiphonics, the ability to play more than one note and kind of split the sound into chords. And then another piece I'm busy with this week is Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale, which is for 7 instruments and narrator. But here's just a fun movement called the Devil's Dance, which I love. And it's an ensemble movement, but here's the bassoon part, just to give you another sense of what the bassoon can do. So, that's the bassoon.
Pretty cool. You might have noticed in the corner of the screen we had a picture of an oscilloscope. And so we have our oscilloscope right here, and on the yellow trace, so we are measuring the time waveform. I just grabbed the microphone, now I'm speaking into it. And you can see as I speak into it, we're seeing these different waveforms right there. Like if I make a kind of a constant sound like a right there, we get a repeating waveform. I just paused it, and so it has this repeating pattern over here. And so as I was saying, these are time domain signals. So I'm recording, or actually doing a transduction where I'm speaking into a microphone. So there's an acoustic signal coming out of my throat and my mouth, and that's propagating through the air, and then that gets measured by the microphone. So how the microphone works is there's a piston in there, or a surface, and the acoustic waves hit the surface and it causes it to vibrate. And there's a little motor inside here, a coil of wire that goes to an amplifier, amplifies the signal, and then we're displaying that electrical signal on the oscilloscope. So we're actually measuring voltage on the amplitude here, but it's really referred to a pressure. It's referred to an acoustic pressure. So you could think of that the larger the amplitude is, the higher the acoustic pressure is on there. And so the same thing when Rachael is playing the bassoon, you can see on the screen, you're basically seeing the pressure signal in the bassoon.
Mm. And I can show a demonstration of going from soft to loud. Mm-hmm. Would you like that?
Sure.
Let's see the pressure change when I change the amount of air blowing through the instrument.
Cool. So there's no volume control there. That's Rachael's skills.
And should we do a little bassoon demo?
Sure.
Talking about the instrument itself acoustically. Mm-hmm. So, the bassoon is part of the woodwind family, along with the flute, oboe, clarinet, saxophone. And we are cousins with the oboe. That's in a way, our closest, in that we both play on a double reed. We play a reed instrument where there's no mouthpiece. The mouthpiece is really two pieces of cane. Essentially, it's a rundodonax, it's like a bamboo, that are folded over from a single piece. The bark is cut off, and then we bind it together with wire and wax. And when we blow into that reed, our air causes the blades of the reed to vibrate open and shut very quickly, and that's where our sound comes from. So it's a really beautiful sound. Which we call our crow. And I say that lovingly. That's a good crow that you heard right there, and it usually makes people cringe when they hear it.
It's like me playing the clarinet.
And then when you're hearing that very raspy, full of harmonic sound of our reed, we put it onto the vocal, and it sounds like this. Which is about a C4 middle C on the piano. And then we put that vocal into the bassoon, and our sound is traveling so much further. It goes down the tenor into the boot. There's a U joint on the end, little U cup at the end, and it goes back up the bore. There's two bores and in the boot, and it continues down up the long joint all the way out the bell. 8 feet of tubing from start to finish for our lowest note. So that C becomes from the vocal sound. To our lowest note. And if Alex puts his hand over the end, if you want, see what happens. He shuts it off. Yeah, so that's an intro to the bassoon, and I think the other really fun thing, besides we have 3.5 octaves, it's quite a large range for a wind instrument. 3.5 octaves of range, and so it's quite flexible. Each octave has a different sound that we associate with our bass and our mid register, and then our tenor register. Each has its own characteristic. And as well, I love that the bassoon can do chords and multiphonics, and lots of contemporary music calls for things like this. Favorite sounds to play around with.
Cool. Yeah, so you're talking about things like chords and multiphonics and tones and everything like that. And that's the frequency domain. So instead of thinking about the sinusoidal time waveform, we're saying, well, we have certain frequency components, and those get summed together to make the whole waveform, is what we're seeing on the oscilloscope.
Do you want to break those down and pick a couple pitches?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So now that you saw the big picture, like what happens when Rachel's playing the instrument, we can look at the oscilloscope and see what this means in terms of signals and systems. So we have our scope here. So our yellow channel is actually pressure. And so we have a microphone, which you just saw the signal. And so we have this Shure SM58 microphone right here. So when Rachel plays, she's generating energy, by blowing into the instrument. So it's a pressure and a velocity goes through the reed she was talking about. It gets resonated in that pipe. Then the instrument acts as a resonator and a filter. So that emits sound, an acoustic signal into the air that we're in. In other words, this wouldn't work in space. You wouldn't be able to play that in a vacuum. And then we pick that acoustic pressure up by the microphone. So the microphone has a piston in it, and when it gets the air pressure, the piston moves back and forth. There's a little coil of wire in there that sends a current to an amplifier. And then we could see that as an electrical signal on the oscilloscope. So if I talk into the microphone really close, you can see the signal gets very large, and it's clipping, if you remember what clipping is. So if I just do something like an and hit stop on the scope, you can see that's basically that waveform right there. And what we're seeing is a representation of the pressure when I make the sound, as measured on as an electrical signal. And so we have time marching on, and then the amplitude there. So even though this is an electrical amplitude, it's really proportional to the air pressure of me making the sound. And so now let's listen to some better sounds, such as the bassoon, not me making sounds. So Rachel, do you want to play some notes?
Sure. I'm going to give you a test based on your
A
frequency
test.
knowledge. Here
Okay,
we go.
yep.
Note number 1.
Okay. Okay, so you can see here we have a very nice, consistent looking waveform, which attests to the caliber of our musician here, and so that's our time waveform. And then down here in the purple, we have what we call the frequency response. So that's a frequency domain thing we were talking about. Whereas if you look at the signal up here, it's very periodic in nature, right? It's not a perfect sine wave, but it's very repetitive. You could see that, if we look at, say, these 2 points over here where their pencil are, they repeat. And we know that the frequency of something is 1 over the period. So can we try to figure out, say, what that period is? And so if I can look at my oscilloscope, it's 20 milliseconds per division in the time domain over there. And I'm seeing how many of those, 1, 2, 3. So about 3 of those waveforms in 20 milliseconds. So it's about like 7 milliseconds, and 1 over 7 is, let's see, I don't even know if I can do that in my head. Let's see, 1/7, I don't know, it's like 0.15 or something like that, maybe. And so now, so that would be the frequency. So maybe 150, right? So now let's go back here. And what I'm doing here, when I'm turning this knob, you can see that purple line moving back and forth. And so getting now to the frequency graph, so we have frequency marching along the horizontal direction. We're looking at this purple, and the amplitude, or the vertical height, tells us what the magnitude, basically, what the peak to peak or magnitude of the sine wave component is that we're measuring out of here. And so actually I'm going to take a step back and say that in order to get the purple waveform, so there's a mathematical algorithm called the fast Fourier transform that operates on this signal, and it breaks it down into its sinusoidal components. So kind of the heart of this lecture is that when we're looking at things in the frequency domain, so we could take a time domain signal like this and decompose it into a sum of sine waves. And then the recipe for the sum of sine waves is what we're seeing here as the frequencies that have like a significant magnitude. So if I move my cursor, so if I move my purple line over there to that first frequency, so it's calling that 130 hertz. And so if that's the fundamental, which I think it is, that's saying that that would be a C3.
Correct.
Oh, thank you. Okay. But interesting thing to note. So the C3 fundamental is 130.81 hertz, I think, precisely. But there's a lot of other frequencies in there. Like if I jog the knob along there, like you can see there's one at 260, and then there's a huge peak that actually gets up to about here at 392. And then we keep on marching along here, and we see something at 522. And it turns out that the frequencies here are multiples of that fundamental frequency. So they'd call this like the second harmonic, third harmonic, fourth harmonic, and it progresses on. And those different components there are really key to what makes the bassoon, or especially that note, sound the way it does. Like it just doesn't sound like a sine wave. It has all these overtones in there. And that's why this waveform right here just doesn't look like a plain old sine wave, of 130 hertz. So shall we play some other notes?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's do an octave up and see how it changes.
Okay. Okay. So stop the scope. So we have an octave up right there. So our fundamental
is now a C4.
Yep. So C4, and so what was that, like 261?
261, yeah.
Okay. So I move my cursor over there, and sure enough, when the cursor is eclipsing that first peak, it's around 260, 261, kind of the resolution of my instrument. And then we have the second harmonic is sitting up there around 530. So that's 2 times the 261.
So very strong octave in this register. What's interesting to me is how this third peak, the second harmonic, is so much weaker, whereas an octave below, it was the third that was the highest.
Yeah, interesting. Should we do a comparison?
Yeah, let's do a comparison. So C3 and C4. Here's the difference here. C3. Pretty cool. Yeah, so you can see that even
it's like you're going up one octave and there's a different frequency response to the instrument, thus you're getting different sounds, but it's maintaining that pitch sort of thing that, we think about when we're tuning instruments.
I got another one. Here's the high C.
Okay. So which C is that?
That's going to be C5.
Yep. So it's going to be around like 523. And sure enough, we move the cursor over there and it's at 523. And in this one, kind of interesting to note is that fundamental has a higher magnitude than all of the overtones.
That's stronger than its overtones.
Yes. And so sure enough, we can see there, so 1.05 kilohertz, and then 1.5 kilohertz. Then we're going off the screen. There's probably some more out here, but we're not seeing them because they're probably in the noise. Like we're next to the mass pike here, so there's a little bit of noise. So we basically turn the volume down on our spectrum analyzer just so we could see the peaks and not the noise.
So that's our C5 is finally the strongest, and we heard C4 and C3. Let's do the lowest C, which is C2, if it'll pick it up.
Yep. Got it. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So let's see. What was the fundamental frequency?
That one
of
is
the
about
C2?
65 hertz.
About 65 hertz. So we'll run our.
It's so tiny you hardly even.
Yep. So run our knob down there, and let's say you need to put that on fine, Phi. And yeah, so we can see it's saying right around 65 hertz, and that is down here. You use the pencil to point to it. So that small peak right there is our fundamental. And this one's interesting because you can see it's packed with harmonics. And same thing here. It's
the higher overtones.
Yeah,
really
these higher overtones are really strong. Yeah. And kind of interesting. Like looking at the signal, it seems like things are really kind of strong in this range right here. So if we kind of made what we call an envelope around there, we had like a Madden chalkboard, so the signals here are larger and they kind of go down. So it makes you wonder if the whole instrument has like a frequency peak somewhere, in this 200 to 500 hertz range.
Above the 500. And our high C was the C5 was really strong, and that's that similar register.
Yeah, so the C5 was the one that had the fundamental higher, right? So if we just look at this picture for a minute and say, okay, so if our peaks and our frequency are kind of in this band here, we could actually frame it with the cursors and bring the cursors over. So that's kind of our strong spot. So now if I turn the scope back on to run, you want to just play some notes and let's just see. Yeah, so that was interesting as Rachel was playing different notes. There are a lot of harmonics, but the really big ones were kind of falling within the the region right there. Saying that there's some intrinsic tuning of the instrument and the acoustics of the room, and even things like how it interacts with the floor and the microphone that was kind of filtering it so that we were seeing the most signal energy in that frequency range, which is pretty cool. I want to do it again just to.
She runs out of air.
Yep. So pretty cool. So as we said, that the energy source or the power source here is Rachel blowing into the instrument. And so if you think of the instrument as, say, something like a second order resonant circuit, which you studied in the class, if it has a high enough Q, you can resonate it. But you're going to still have things like damping and absorption taking away from the signal. So you have to put energy into it in order to sustain it. Otherwise, it'll die out.
And what if we do a dynamic change, so a change in amplitude?
Oh, that would be cool, kind of like raising the volume and lowering it again. Okay, let's do it. Yep. Very cool. So it's an interesting sound right there. And when we were looking at the spectrum, you could see that the certain peaks were growing, but they were sort of growing, I guess, at a at a constant value. Like it was like multiplying all the different frequencies by a constant. Want to do it again?
Sure. Should we try more
Okay.
exponential or some sort of more
Sure. Yeah.
less even crescendo?
Sure.
So to speak?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Player's choice. So you can see it dying away there. So I know this class is a class on linear systems, but there's actually some nonlinear stuff in there where she's blowing harder. It was exciting different modes and causing different frequencies to to jump out that weren't there before. But we'll save that for a later nonlinear dynamics class.
And one other question I have is if musicians are always working to color our sound and change our sound. So within a single pitch, being able to create different sounds is a goal. And I wonder how that shows up here. If I'm able to adjust, when you freeze in on a single frequency and there's all that different activity, can we adjust that? I'm not sure. So my two different pictures, perhaps. I'm not sure. Let's see. If I do a C3, I'm going to go back to C3. Versus
yeah, I could see. Oh, I missed it, but it almost looked like there was a little bit of a change in the proportion of those two peaks that were down around here.
Maybe it's partly pitch and also formation of the mouth. If I say O versus E, it will get a different pitch sound or sound. Kind of a richer sound or a little more contained.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the richer sound might be more harmonics, right? And you can see here, like, as she's playing, like the relative heights of the peaks here were changing, which was changing the quality of it. So that's pretty cool. And so this is an introduction to the frequency domain. And let's see.
What else? Anything in terms of seeing what a chord looks like?
Sure. Yeah.
You want to try that?
Yep. Let's look at a chord.
So if we play a fundamental fingering of an A flat, and then remove a finger that should be there, I'll get a chord. A chord will pop out. So you'll hear the fundamental A flat and then a multiphonic, a chord that's based on that A flat.
Cool. You can see here as she lifted her finger up, some of the frequency content changed, but some of it also remained the same.
Cool. And what about if the reed alone? What does that sound like?
Yep. Okay, so that was interesting, and that you can see the signal down there. There's not really many peaks. There's one peak over there, and you almost heard that as a whistle. Like I could kind of hear that whistle, and so that was around like 1.3 kilohertz or 1300 hertz. But so this is a noise signal, and an interesting thing to note, a noise signal generally is broadband. In other words, like there's a lot of energy in a lot of different frequencies, and you can imagine if you're trying to play this instrument, play all different kinds of notes, you might want to provide all different types of frequencies, like all the frequencies that it could possibly play through that reed. And that's probably what's happening here, is that the reed is basically giving you a broadband signal, and then as she moves her fingers around, and the dynamics of the lengths of the pipes and everything, and how you change it when you're closing and opening the holes, I guess you'd call them, or stops, like that selects different frequencies. So the instrument acts as a filter. It filters out this broadband noise signal, and then that's what we hear coming out of it. You want to do that again a little closer?
With the reed?
You guys, just the reed a little closer, just to kind of drive that point home.
Yeah, here's the reed.
Yep, so a few peaks in there, but it is a broadband signal, and you can see it's exciting a lot of frequencies. But kind of interesting thing to note is, remember earlier we were talking about a lot of the energy kind of falls in where my fingers are right here. And interestingly enough, it seems like there's quite a bit of energy in that same frequency band right there, meaning that if the reed can generate more energy in that frequency band, then the instrument's going to be louder at those frequencies. So I heard there's something called vibrato. Can you demonstrate what vibrato is?
A little bit of pulsation within the air creates a sound of vibrato, which is something like this.
So you can see there when it got louder, it almost looked like the peaks were splitting. Can you do that again?
So straight. First, I'll do a straight tone with no vibrato.
Very narrow peaks.
And then with vibrato added.
I froze it there, and you can see this one right here is very wide, and it's basically the frequency is moving back and forth, so the frequency is oscillating, and that's why we have the wide peak. It almost looks like it has two peaks built into one, which are probably kind of the extremities. Just turns out that our oscilloscope, when it's making this Fourier transform, it takes a chunk of the waveform, and because it does that, it kind of averages it out. Otherwise, we'd see, if we had a faster instrument, we'd actually see that peak moving back and forth as the vibrato is playing. So pretty cool stuff.
What other questions do you have?
Wave generator. So how does all this, musical stuff relate to EK307? And so, well, there's something called filters. You can make electronic filters, and you're going to actually make them in this lab. And we're going to make what we call passive filters, which are just RC circuits, which you made a lot of before. So where you put an input signal on there, and it goes through you measure it on the output across the capacitor, and that acts like a filter. And so why would you want a filter? Well, sometimes you want to filter out certain frequencies. Like we have a function generator over here, and you can see my function generator. And if I connect my generator right there, I'm putting a frequency tone, which is actually 261. So that was like a middle C into the loudspeaker. So it's in front of our microphone. And we have Rachael over there playing. And so if we go back, with just the loudspeaker playing, so you can see that that middle C is right there, and we can verify that it's actually at the proper frequency. And so, sure enough, it's showing in the low 260s right there. So it's driving, and then I could move that, so I could do what we call a frequency sweep, where if I turn the knob on the function generator, there, you can see the signal on the oscilloscope is moving up, kind of analogous to Rachael playing higher frequencies. And that sounds a little awful because the speaker is distorting. And so say you have this signal right here and you're trying to listen to someone play a musical instrument. I'll turn it down a little bit. So you can see as I turn it down, the peak's getting smaller. So say we're in a concert and this function generator is there. How would we get rid of that? Guess maybe play a score. I think you matched the frequency, didn't you?
Well, I cheated.
Yes.
I did a little test first.
Yeah.
It's around an A for the 880.
So I'll turn down our noise there, but you can see that would clearly be an annoying thing. And so I'll do one more take of that, and we'll freeze the screen. Okay, so now if we look back at our screen here, so we have, I'm just going to turn that off because it's annoying. And so we have, the Bassoon waveforms, these little peaks over here. And then this one right here is what we call a noise, right? That's that annoying signal right there. And so we could use a filter in the electronic domain, like say if we're actually recording this, which we are on this telephone, we could filter out that frequency with our RC filter. And I wish I had a chalkboard right here. And we could do what they call low pass filter it out. Like, so a low pass filter, say if I just wanted the frequency content braced by my fingers right there, that's on the low frequency end, right? Low frequencies are to the left, high frequencies to the right. So I want to pass the low frequencies and block out the high frequencies. And so that's where our EK307 circuits come in, where we could build a low pass filter And what the filter does is in the frequency domain, it multiplies each individual frequency by another function. And so the function would look, say, if this white line right there, the dotted line was 1. So we're multiplying all these frequencies by 1. And then as we get up to the frequency 1 and attenuate, we start to attenuate. We go down, we multiply it by a smaller and smaller number, ideally 0, but in theory we can't actually get to 0. So we'll show you some more of those, on a whiteboard, because it's hard to show on the oscilloscope screen. But we could have the converse problem, where maybe if we had a low frequency signal and that was the noise, and we wanted to have the high frequency signal come in. So maybe we can go over here and try to set that up. Our loudspeaker's on the small side, so we might not be able to do it, but we might be able to get maybe like 100 hertz signal out of this thing. Let's see. It's very quiet. So I'll crank up the amplitude over here. Okay, I can hear it. And then we'll go over here, turn our scope back on. And so it's such a small signal, I can't get much of it, but if I put this, oh, there we go. So I moved the microphone right in front of the speaker now. So it's a good way to improve your signal to noise ratio. And so you can see the waveform's actually a little distorted because the loudspeaker isn't perfect, but that frequency is showing up, that big dominant peak right there is showing up at 100 hertz, which is what we set on the function generator. So now say if we had a low frequency problem and Rachel is playing high frequency notes. Okay, so we just froze the screen. So we have our noise signal there, and then she's playing some notes, which are comprised of, so that's probably the fundamental right there, so at 300 hertz, and then some overtones. And so now we want to filter out the low frequencies, so we want to keep this component over here, the high frequencies, so we want to pass the high frequencies and filter out the low frequencies. And so in that case, you'd use what they call a high pass filter, because you're passing the highs, and you're trying to block out the low frequencies. We hope you enjoyed this demonstration on the frequency domain. So we have our frequency domain generator right here. And so just to kind of sum it up in engineering terms, so we have a very nice person here, but she's also an energy source, right? She can provide velocity and pressure to the instrument. So the instrument is acting as a resonator and a filter. That gets picked up by a microphone, goes through amplification. You can view that on the oscilloscope. We can do different things and record it. And then you can filter it out. So in the lab, you'll be building some filters to filter out some signals. And hopefully this gave you a little bit of an idea of what's in the frequency domain. So we'd certainly like to thank Rachel for coming in today and helping us make this. It was a lot more fun and certainly better than if I pulled out the clarinet.
Thank you, Alex.
So
thank you,
Rachel.
everyone. My pleasure. And I feel like you just gave me a few more lines for my LinkedIn bio.
Oh, yeah.
Frequency domain
Frequency
generator.
domain generator,
That's
yes.
the next thing.
That's right, harmonic generator. Thank you.
Done.